If you're selling your soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay, well, nothing's gonna change if all you do is wish you could wake up and it not be true. Join a union. Fight for better pay, you better join a union, brother. Organize today, you'll see where the problem really lies when the union comes around. Rich men earning north of $1 million wanna keep the working folk down.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I'm joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and by our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. And the voice you just heard is somebody whose music I've loved for decades, Billy Bragg, singing his tweak on the viral country song "Rich Men North of Richmond." And so his version of it is called "Rich Men Earning North of $1 Million," and I actually really, so I played that, want to play that for a couple of reasons. One, I just like it; and it makes me happy. And two, I don't know, I really liked the energy that Billy was bringing to it. That if you go and look at the YouTube video he posted that we took that from, and he's describing so I guess he just posted this yesterday. He's describing the sort of thought process behind his writing it, and for people who aren't, I assume most people watching this probably are familiar at least somewhat because it's sort of inescapable. There was much discourse about it. This song, "Rich Men North of Richmond," because it's got these very economic populist lyrics. Some of the first stanza of Billy Bragg's version is taken almost verbatim with, a little bit of tweak. And there's stuff, there's stuff in it that I like, but there's also, like a lyric that's like bashing welfare recipients, and it has, there's the very fact that the title is "Rich Men North of Richmond," like the one south of there. Okay. And so there's, I think, because I don't really know where Oliver Anthony is at or what his sort of overall worldview is. I think he's maybe expressing some like real working class complaints, but also has absorbed some right-wing talking points, and it all kind of comes out in the song. But I really like the energy that Billy Bragg is taking to this kind of response or tweak, where he says, "Since I saw that clip of Oliver Anthony singing his song 'Rich Men North of Richmond,' the ghost of Woody Guthrie has been whispering in my ear, help that guy out, what he keeps telling me. Let him know there's a way to deal with these problems that he's singing about." And, I don't know. I mean, that just seems like the sort of perfect mindset to me to bring to this, right? And sort of to break out of the kind of endless culture war cycle of how we digest things like this, and you love it or you hate it, depending, and just be like, hey, what's in here that's sort of something you can maybe work with, and what's something that's just really flawed, and what's missing from this, right? That like, hey, you've got all these complaints about working overtime for bullshit pay. Brother, you are not wrong. But like, there's an answer.
And I mean, this is exactly what Woody Guthrie would do, because Woody Guthrie is known for taking songs and writing new lyrics to it. So, way to go, continuing the Woody Guthrie legacy here of really, just bring it to the working man, and continuing that, like taking songs that the working man will know, and give it lyrics that the working man deserve.
Yeah, exactly. Or even like the which is a long-standing tradition in American labor radicalism, go back to like a lot of the songs in like the Wobbly songbook.
Yeah, the Joe Hill stuff.
Exactly. And although, or sometimes even for more immediate logistical reasons, that they'd wait until the Salvation Army band started up and like kind of substitute their own their own lyrics. But anyway, really wanted to highlight that. But there are a few other things I want to hit before getting into the main event tonight, which is going to be my debate with Tibor Rutar, which I'm happy to say I got like half an hour in before making the Simpsons joke. That there's the episode, I think it's the one where Marge gets the job at the power plant because they need the money for home repairs, and Homer's giving her the sort of tricks for how to do well on the job. And he's like, when something goes wrong, just blame the foreign guy, Tibor. So in any case, but yeah, Tibor Rutar, I talk all about who he is and what he's written and what he's written about me and my response to him and all that stuff in the debate itself. So we don't need to do any of that now to set it up. But basically, we are going to do a follow-up at some point where we get to some subjects we didn't get to today. But the stuff that we do get to is kind of how to feel like about Marxist theory of history, which he has a lot of problems with, and I was defending, and also how to sort of think about the goals of the left. If like just kind of Nordic model social democracy is good enough, or we should want something that goes beyond that. So yeah, looking forward to showing people this. I was just texting our live show producer Jordan earlier, and I was saying that Rutar is that rarest of creatures, a anti-Marx guy who's actually read a bunch of Marxist literature, which made him really interesting to talk to, because that is not what I'm used to. So from certainly the people with the biggest megaphones. So since the last episode of the show came out, I wrote an article, had an article out for Jacobin. I think it actually came out the day after the last episode, which we may or may, yeah, here we go. It's called "Conservatives Think Marxism is Anything That Scares Them," and it has to do with well, actually, instead of me saying what it is now, I'm going to play a couple of minutes of my conversation about this on the Left Reckoning post game, if we have that screen share ready. So this was last week's Left Reckoning post game, and we're just going to play a few minutes of it now. But okay, one, you should be a Left Reckoning patron, and even if you're not, I think they did actually clip this whole part, right? So you can go over there to watch the rest of it. But let's just watch the first part of that now.
Other misinformation artists. Unless you had anything more on our boy Poole here.
No, which misinformation artists are you referring to?
Pause.
Yeah, we're talking about conservatives and Marx.
Yes.
Ben.
I should say the context there is that we just spent like an hour shitting on Tim Poole, but that's some of that was clipped too. So that's if you didn't quite get what he's talking about there. We watched the Tim Poole PragerU thing where he's talking about how he came from nothing, working at a business that was owned by his parents, and then somehow through his sheer talent became what he is now.
I mean, that's how you bootstrap yourself up in this society. Is you have rich parents, but that's how you've pulled yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so some of the bootstraps are in different places than others. But anyway, let's. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of give context for that. But sorry, let's watch the rest of.
Oh, good. I like the way that Matt is looking up at you. I'm sorry, I don't look at you the same way. I apologize.
Yeah, get you a producer who will look at you.
Has a great piece out in Jacobin. Conservatives think Marxism is anything that scares them. And I wanted I want you to set this up. Actually, let's say you set this up, because there's a line in here that actually I really like, Ben, But can you tell us who you're responding to here, and then we can get into some of the nitty gritty here about the way that conservatives often present Marx?
Sure. I mean, the framing at the beginning is a little bit broader, but like the main case that I'm talking about throughout the article is this guy, Yoram Hazoni, who is, I suspect, a name a fair number of people in the audience won't know, but he's a pretty big name. I think objectively, he's probably the kind of main thinker behind what's called national conservatism, or often known as the NatCons, which is something that's like gotten to be a pretty big deal in the contemporary right. So they have these NatCon conferences. One of the many funny things about this, by the way, is like just how internationalist the NatCons seem to be. That there's like an awful lot of global cooperation, among NatCons in different places. Doesn't seem very nationalist to me, but whatever. So Hazoni is Israeli. He was born in Israel. He grew up in the U.S. and then went back to Israel, I think for college or after college, and has lived there for many decades. But these NatCon conferences, like you'll see certainly American politicians like Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley. I think Ted Cruz might have even been at some NatCon conferences. But you'll also see Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary's increasingly, I don't know what the term of art would be, but increasingly tenuously democratic, right-wing government, and Hazoni wrote a big book last year called Conservatism: A Rediscovery, and he's got a chapter in it called The Challenge of Marxism. And what really got to me as I was reading this is like, look, I think Yoram's, I've talked to him a little bit. I think he's a smart guy. I expect to like when I read something, he's written, I expect to fundamentally disagree with and abhor everything, right? But I was actually a little surprised. I mean, just not to sugarcoat this. I mean, just how sort of shallow this was. Basically, Yoram's way of using the word Marxism is indistinguishable from Ron DeSantis talking about woke is cultural Marxism and shit like that. It's all the same, right? So I wanted to just kind of take apart all the stuff he says about this and just kind of show that's how ridiculous it is to describe this stuff as Marxism, and how irrelevant it is as a critique of the real thing.
Yeah, I mean, it goes into a lot of kind of classic right-wing attacks on Marx, tropes of right-wing attacks on Marx, at least contemporarily, right? Yeah. James Lindsay, basically Marx is just a Manichaean. It was just good versus evil, oppressor versus oppressed, right? And it becomes this kind of incoherent. First of all, as I always point out, it's that's just in the Bible, y'all.
Yeah.
Right. You know what I mean? So to act, or Machiavelli, right? So to act like these things are what the reason also, that people are into Marx is not because he ever talked about oppressed people standing up against their oppressors, but rather the very specific material way that he was talking about it. These are not new ideas. And I just want to quote this line, Ben, because I thought it was really good. If Marxism were nothing more than the view that whatever society any given Marxist found himself in was divided into groups, where some of these groups treated others in an unjust way, then Marxism rather dramatically predated the birth of Karl Marx. When Spartacus led a slave revolt in ancient Rome, were he and his followers Marxists, right? And in fairness, Ben, to your intellectual opponent here, Marx was very praising of Spartacus. Yeah. But no, your point, I think, is very, very valid here, right? It becomes, you take everything out of Marxism to make it this kind of vague philosophy of good versus bad, oppressed versus oppressor.
All right. So yeah, that's the I kind of try to take the Jacobin article about Hazoni as a chance to both kind of say, hey, here's what Marx actually says, what makes Marxism distinct, and also like basically make the argument that a lot of the people who annoy Hazoni, who he's really talking about, right? When he's talking about the Marxists who've supposedly taken over the universities and the this and the that, right? That are that like make the point that these people he's talking about are liberals, right? I mean, sort of maybe a little bit what Adam Proctor and I back on the Dead Pundit Society, or Adam certainly. I think I was nicer about it back then. I've gotten grumpier as I've aged, but the would call like rad libs, like radical liberals, but I mean like essentially just liberals, and that so wanted to do basically two things. One is to say, hey, you're using this term in such a vague way as to make it meaningless, and you're not really saying anything that even lands as a criticism of the real thing. And by the way, these people you're talking about, look, actual Marxists don't tend to like them either, and vice versa, right? That's if you're really talking about very different rival ideologies here, and here's kind of what the difference is between that. So people can read that article at Jacobin. Let's do the graphic one more time. But yeah, conservatives think Marxism is anything that scares them. Like the sort of larger point here, just to set up the debate with Tibor, is that this is kind of what I'm used to, even from people as relatively, as smart as Yoram Hazoni, which, to be clear, I don't think he's a dumb guy. I think I think he's wrong about most things, but I think that like there are many subjects on which he's capable of having a nuanced conversation. It's just that the subject of Marxism doesn't seem to bring out that side of him. And then, of course, when you kind of go below the Yoram Hazoni conservatism book level, then it gets to be stuff like this. Let's watch the first Fox clip.
Check out his podcast, What the Hell is Going On with Critical Race Theory. It was very good, very informative. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. On the Princeton point here, you and I have discussed it at the college level. This is fair game. Go ahead and do it, right? Absolutely. I mean, I remember 20 years old going to Trier, Germany, and trying to find the home of Karl Marx because, 1848, he wrote Mein Kampf. I want to know what it was all about. So that's part of the education in America, if you so choose. So that's that. More to come. Meanwhile,
yeah, that's. I want to be fair about this. He did correct himself. We have Fox too.
Recounting Durst's childhood, but Judge Mark Wyndham told him to back off, that he'd have a chance later to cross-examine Durst on Berman's murder.
Wow, what a case. Thank you, William. We'll see where that goes. William Lajeunesse there in L.A. Watch that trial here. I misspoke. 1848, Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto. All right.
And off he went.
I shall.
Same thing.
Tone of voice was Alex Trebek correcting you on Jeopardy with what the actual correct answer was. And I think that the tone of voice maybe belies the fact that it wasn't just a misspeak. I don't know. I can't. We don't know for sure, but it sounded like he was like, oh, that's what it actually was. So I don't know. Body language experts will have to weigh in.
So close. The answer was the Communist Manifesto. The one that's arguing for bottom-up radical democracy, not the turgid ranting in advocacy of authoritarianism and genocide. It's a really, really easy mistake to make. Okay, so that's where the bar is set. So it was, I have to say, really a pleasure to have this argument with Tibor, who is, I think wrong in his own way, but is just like, extremely well read about all of this and is attacking the real thing. So with no further ado, since it's going to take up the vast majority of the episode tonight, let's watch the Tibor Rutar debate, and we will come back for just a minute at the end of the episode and then go to the post game for patrons. All right. I am now joined by Matt McManus, who requires no introduction here, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Tibor Rutar in Slovenia, surely the least populated place in the world with the most writing about Marx going on per capita of any nation in the world. How are you guys doing today?
Hi, I'm awesome. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here, Ben and Matt.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this. I should say I enjoyed reading Tibor's book, and I also enjoyed reading Ben's rejoinder to Tibor's book. So I'm excited for this. Should be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So I guess maybe as thinking about how to do this, I'll just kind of start us out and then more or less toss over the keys to Matt, who's kind of our I think if not neutral interlocutor, his views is at least far more zen than I am, so I'll let him direct the discussion thereafter, but I guess just before that, just to kind of start out, Tibor, this book, that you wrote, Capitalism for Realists, is, when I talked about it on the show before, at that point, all I'd read was the pages from it that were about me, right? So because I'd been told from Chris Freeman had been telling me on Twitter for months that that this article I'd written for Jacobin, which was called economic freedom rankings don't tell us anything about capitalism, that there's this like refutation in in Tibor Rutar's new book, and so I was obviously very curious to read that, right? So I just read that part of it, and then we did a segment on the show when Kuba was here, responding kind of point by point to those couple pages. But I will also say that that since the context of all this, and actually let me just back up just a second to sort of give people more context before you tell us what you actually say in the book, because I think I gave viewers a misleading impression in that earlier segment because I'd read so little of it at the time, right? So the context of the whole thing from my perspective is back in fall of 2021. I participated in this forum, this conference kind of thing at George Mason University that was like co-sponsored by the Mercatus Center, so those are libertarians, and the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And so basically it was me and Hadass here from Jacobin and a couple of libertarians from Mercatus doing like panels and having arguments and discussions about things over the weekend, and students applied to attend. And in the lead up to this, they gave everybody a chance to like sort of give people readings to do. And one of the readings that I was given, to do by the libertarians was this thing called by Peter Leeson, called "Two Cheers for Capitalism?" ? Which is this article arguing, I think actually, ironically enough, against more or less your position, but is because he's arguing against people who think that capitalism only deserves two cheers as opposed to three, and in that article, he makes very heavy use of the Fraser Institute's economic freedom rankings. And he also, there were some things even in the article that raised some red flags to me about those rankings. The most striking one, which I didn't even mention in my article because I couldn't find the original data that he was looking at, so I just had to leave it out. But The most striking one is that he gives examples of countries that have, become, well, Leeson's terminology is less capitalist. So that's what I kind of used in my response, but, less economically free in the original terminology of the Fraser rankings in this 25-year period he was looking at between 1980 and 2005. And one of the countries, he said, became less capitalist between 1980 and 2005 based on its Fraser score was Ukraine. So the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1980 was apparently more capitalist than Ukraine in 2005, which struck me as really unlikely and made me think that there was probably something funny going on with these rankings. And so I wrote this Jacobin article making all these criticisms of the methodology of the rankings, which we'll get into in the main body of the discussion. And in your book, you responded to that and and gave a qualified defense of the value of the rankings. And because at that point all I'd read were the pages where you were responding to me, and because the Fraser Institute, they're libertarians too. So I think I'd have to go back and watch it to see the exact words that I used, but I think I probably gave, viewers the impression that you were a libertarian, which is not at all your position. And so I guess before, we kind of toss over the keys to Matt to start the discussion about the issues of dispute, I was wondering if you wanted to just kind of give people a sense of where you're generally coming from ideologically, kind of what your background is, and what conclusions you arrive at in the rest of the book, the part's not about me.
Yeah, thanks. Awesome, Ben. That's very helpful. Sure. So around 10 years ago, as an undergraduate student, I started becoming interested. I started becoming interested in various intellectual pursuits, and I came across Marxism. This was in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008. And I became a Marxist. I became a socialist activist, socialist organizer. I and my Marxist reading group that then evolved into a socialist party, basically. And this party still exists right now. It's called the Left. It's actually a part of the coalitionary government, which can be a bad or a good thing. Definitely not a socialist Marxist organization anymore, but whatever. So I was a Marxist, a socialist activist, not organizer. And throughout the years, I slowly started, I guess, abandoning my Marxism. I would not say that I'm an ex-Marxist now, that I've completely overturned everything that Marx said or something like that. I would say that I'm, I guess, a post-Marxist. I am a social democratic, or maybe some of the Americans would say even democratic socialist kind of guy that thinks that America should look much more like Europe, and Sweden, Norway, and Denmark in particular. That is, you guys should get a collective bargaining, or sectoral bargaining. All of us should get UBIs, so universal basic income and stuff like that. And in my social scientific pursuits, because I'm a sociologist, I'm a professor of sociology, I would say I'm a conflictual or a conflict sociologist of the Weberian provenance, and I still agree with some things that Marx said. I just abandoned his overarching framework, which commands, or which says that when you try to explain social phenomena, you should primarily deduce them from the material or the economic class relations that prevail in society. That was too constricting for me. So yeah, I guess the post-Marxist social democrat kind of guy.
Yeah, so the book is called Capitalism for Realists, Virtues and Vices of the Modern Economy. And I guess what you're arguing for is that kind of is that kind of moderate social democratic sort of form of capitalism, but you don't fundamentally object to capitalist property relations anymore. You think they need to be softened by a variety of reforms. Would that be a kind of fair characterization of your overall position?
Exactly. Although I would definitely want us, all of us in the world, to try and experiment with economic democracy much more. I think I would argue against you, Ben, but this is a different debate. I would argue against you when you say that economic freedom, economic democracy should be mandated, that every worker should work in a worker-owned or worker-managed firm. But I would definitely want for us so that states, that governments, maybe try to incentivize the opening up of cooperatives much more than they presently do. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is not gonna bring us to more agreement. But I don't think every worker should work in a worker-owned firm. I think some of them should work in state-owned firms. But in any case,
if a little girl on a fucking street opens up a lemonade stand and gets her brother
but I want to
work in
say
it.
red guards to smash it up. That's my position. Yes. To be clear, no. I think, I do think so. I should also say, so I'm writing a book. I'm writing a book for Verso with Bhaskar Sankara and Mike Begg called The Blueprint, where we go into sort of exactly what we think a post-capitalist society could look like.
Nice.
I hope that by the time people are watching this, since we're several hours in the past right now because Tibor is in Slovenia, and when the show is live, it's like 3 a.m. or something for him. So I hope by the time people are watching this, we've already announced this event we're going to be doing in Chicago to talk about the book and everything. But I'll just say,
awesome.
I think that the the sort of position we take there, I think it works out to no smashing up lemonade stands, but I do think in effect, right, like new businesses that were started, would like that it would be, very difficult to sort of get funding for anything that wouldn't be organized that way. That would be a good thing, from my perspective, right? So I think there is a real disagreement with Tibor about that, as well, I imagine, as expropriation for existing, not lemonade stands, but Fortune 500 companies, certainly, and et cetera, right? So in any case, so there is definitely a rich set of disagreements there, and even though it's not directly what we're talking about today, I think it does inform a lot of it. It is probably going to be relevant for viewers to understand the difference in where we're coming from. And then the other half of this is that you wrote this article for Areo magazine earlier this summer called Marxism, the idea that refuses to die. I wrote.
Of course, Ben, just a second. I'm sorry. Of course, this is not my title, as you probably imagine.
Yeah, fair enough. It's. I'm sure your title would be much would be more. Would express a subtler position, but also be less eye-catching. So it is what it is. But that's Tibor's article. And then
it's kind of fun also that Marx is just glaring out at the fucking title, being like, "How fucking dare you?"
Exactly.
And then yesterday on my Substack, I have this response to this called "Why I'm Still a Marxist," a response to Tibor Rutar, and I believe next week maybe there's going to be a response that's going to be running on the same one from you to that. And I do want to say, like, I mean, obviously there are very sharp disagreements there on both a lot of the sort of individual questions you canvass about Marx's theory of history, Marx's theory of exploitation, etc. But also on sort of what that adds up to in terms of overall assessments, right, of Marx, or what we might have in mind when we use the word Marxism. But something that I think was clear to me even when I wrote this, just based on reading your article, and has become much more clear to me based on subsequent emails, is that you're somebody who, look, the world is full of ex-Marxists who take other positions now. Jim Cramer, was a member of the Spartacus League in college. There's I don't know.
Horowitz. What's your guy? Horowitz
David
something.
Horowitz.
It's an old guy. David Horowitz.
Yeah, exactly. Ramparts. Yeah. and yeah, he does like the professor, you know, dangerous subversive professor watch list thing now. He has there's you know, I think Tony Blair might have been in like the International Marxist Tendency or something at that point early in his development, right? So the world is full of ex-Marxists who take other political positions, and you know, there's a pretty wide range in how, you know, how much they knew about it at the time, whether this is something they were sort of interested in for 6 weeks in college, or, you know, and certainly how much they've retained, you know, over the decades since then, or in the case of somebody like Horowitz, who surely does know more, how much it's convenient for him to have retained since then. But you're really not in that category, by which I mean that you know, one part of the reason that your criticisms are interesting to me, even if I disagree, is that in certain ways, not others, we'll get into it, I'm sure, I think the kind of Marxist you were is, you know, is very sort of congenial to me. There's like a lot of what, you know, it's called analytical Marxism in the mix there. And the other is that you do, like, I mean, granted, the bar is set just like, you know, just on, like, you know, at the volcanic core of the earth, right? You know, that's like, but it's so low, right? But so it's understating the case to say that it's like much better informed, you know, than the most published criticisms of Marx. But it's you know, but I mean, this is stuff that you really you know, you've really done the reading about very, very extensively, and I'm sure we're going to get to areas where, you know, once we get to that part where you're going to talk about stuff and be like, man, I need to. You know, I need to write down those books and, you know, check it out and get back to you. But so it's not a sort of you know, it's not a skimming the Communist Manifesto kind of critique. You know,
you remind me of Jordan Peterson in his debate with Slavoj Žižek. I mean, that was just a total train wreck.
Yeah, that was probably one of the most sublime moments of my life, where my wife and I were actually on our honeymoon in Acapulco, and when I wasn't drinking, actually, no, I was drinking a margarita. But while I was drinking a margarita, I was like, we should take a pause and just see this. And I was like, man, how do you even fucking open a debate with, yeah, I've kind of skimmed your books, and I've also kind of half-assed skimmed the other one. I'm never tired of enjoying that.
Skim Slavoj's books, but you know, I think he was just like, oh, that seems like it would take too much time. I just read the Communist Manifesto. And yeah, and so in, for example, in that debate, you know, Peterson sort of says, you know, Marx is admitting that capitalism is incredibly efficient and productive. I mean, he confessed it, you know, at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. I don't know what we're still talking about, right? And in this way that you know, that shows you that that, you know, he doesn't have any kind of conceptual framework for understanding how these ideas, you know, fit together, whereas you definitely do. So, you know, whatever. I don't, you know, that's you know, I think you're wrong, but I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong about the right thing. You know, it's targeted at the real thing, not, you know, not even like you know, in a way that's just far too unusual, certainly at least for popular press articles. So did want to give you credit on that, but at this point we can stop agreeing with each other. I can toss over the keys to Matt. I think for however long we end up having here, I think like maybe an hour or a quarter at max, I think is probably our hard out, right? But I think we're gonna do is, you know, we're going to try to do at least something of substance on the freedom rankings disagreement, and at least something of substance on the Marx disagreement. Mm-hmm. But with that, I cede the chair to Matt.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm very pleased to be hosting this debate. I should say also that I've read Tibor's book, Capitalism for Realists. I have a review coming out for Arch Digital this week. It's a very interesting book. It's very well written. It's very sharp. I also have disagreements that I state in this review, but I would strongly encourage anyone to go read it because you'll learn a lot, as I did, and certainly even if you have problems with the book, you'll gain a lot from engaging with it argumentatively and analytically, as I did, and I'm sure that Ben did as well. So Tibor, thanks a lot for coming. I wanted just to start off by talking a little bit about the Marx issue, and then kind of moving towards more general problems, because I think that if we tackle the theoretical basis of this disagreement first, it'll help inform our discussion of the empirics a little bit later on. And those are really what's more important anyway. So let's start with the more conceptual stuff. As good materialists, we need to go to the concrete as what's truly important, right? So I was wondering, in the book, you characterize yourself as something of a soft materialist. In this kind of very broad sense, you acknowledge that there are still insights that you draw from Marx and from the Marxist tradition, but you are very critical of other aspects, which you already unpacked a little bit in your opening comments. So I was wondering if you could give us 2 areas where you think that you would still adhere to this kind of broadly soft materialist viewpoint, and how that informs your approach to the study of capitalism contemporaneously, and 2 areas that were decisive for you in breaking from the label Marxism, or breaking from identifying as a Marxist towards being a post-Marxist, a democratic socialist, somebody who's kind of like, it was good while it lasted, and we'll always have fun memories, but that was for the summer of 2015, and now we're all grown up.
So I think there are 2 ways in which I understand materialism, or 2 types of materialism that are important for understanding social scientific analysis that proceeds from that. So one type of materialism is simply the idea that when people act, when societies change, when societies develop, most of the causal force behind that comes from people's material interests. Now, what are material interests? Well, usually those are interests having to do with the economic side of life. So things like improving your welfare, your material well-being, getting more money, but also political stuff like increasing your political power, having more capacity to affect change, and so on. So materialism is distinct from idealism in the sense that I think that if you want to describe how societies work and how various social phenomena come into existence, we have to primarily, not exclusively, but primarily look at people's material interests, mostly political power and economic power, while ideology, or what some Marxists would call false consciousness, stuff like that, culture, norms, those are more, not epiphenomenal, but those are of a more of a second order for me. Now, and I remain a materialist in this sense. So this is somebody who subscribes to basic rational choice theory, which characterizes some people as actors who want to maximize happiness or something like that. And then they are rational in the sense that they choose the appropriate means in the given social environment. Of course, people are not asocial to achieve those goals. I am materialist in that sense. Doron Acemoglu, mainstream neoclassical economists, institutional economists, even Austrians, not so much, but many people are materialist in that sense, not only Marxists. Now, another way of characterizing materialism, I think, is specific to Marxism, and that is ascribing in your social scientific pursuits to something that is that's called the causal, explanatory, and predictive primacy of class relations, where class relations are a synonym for production relations, that is, relations between people when they're involved in economic pursuits. And in class societies, of course, those relations are exploitative. So class relations are relations between the exploiter class and the exploited class. And I think that the materialism I hewed to 10 years ago that was most attractive to me was this second Marxist type of materialism. And this is now what I think I've shed under the influence of 2 types of social scientific literature. On the one hand are the neo-Weberians like Anthony Giddens. His book from the 80s, A Contemporary Critique of Historical Materialism, was very formative for me. First, as somebody who saw Giddens as a rival, somebody that I have to defeat. In my PhD, I tried to argue against Giddens's critique of historical materialism and in favor of the causal primacy of class relations. And also Michael Mann. Michael Mann is just a tremendous historical sociologist. He wrote 4 volumes titled I think, The Sources of Social Power. And again, he criticizes Marxism. Those 2 reluctantly, through the years, dragged me away from my Marxist materialism. And the other school of thought that influenced me from, let's say, 2018 in the past 5 years on was mainstream, or not mainstream, new institutional economics. So the Rona Acemoglu, Why Nations Fail, The Narrow Corridor, Progress and Power is the latest book by Daron. That sort of stuff made me realize, wait a second, I agree with everything that they say, but this is not Marxism. So am I myself not a Marxist anymore? Well, fuck, I guess I'm not. Something like that.
Okay, that's very fair. So, Ben, what I think I'm going to do is ask one critical question, just to kind of add a little bit of depth to this, and then we'll turn to you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, good. Excellent. So, when you were talking about being under the influence of these neo-Iberians, it actually reminded me of Left of Phil's Lillian Cicercia and the episode they did on Weber, why he has this bad effect of dragging people in sociology away from Marxism. So that seems like you're a case in point there. So I wanted to say, I think that the way that a sophisticated Marxism would respond to you, or sophisticated Marxists would respond to you, I'll just play the interlocutor here, would be to acknowledge that there's definitely a kind of reductive, or as they're sometimes called, vulgar Marxist approach to power and materialism that can reduce everything down very crudely to a set of economic relations, and particularly the kind of class dynamics that emerge from that. But certainly since, Kautsky got into his famous debate with Bernstein, there have been more sophisticated Marxist accounts of power and history that have emerged. Granted, many of these deviate considerably from the orthodoxy. And I know you address this in the book, right? How far can you deviate from the orthodoxy and still be called a Marxist? But I'll give one example recently. So I have a review coming out of Soren Mao's really good book, Mute Compulsion, in The Nation in a few days. And he says, listen, the basic Marxist project of theorizing power, for example, from a historical materialist standpoint, is obviously unfinished at the time Marx was dead. He projected to write 7 volumes of Capital, only ever published 1, then really kind of finished 3 with Engel's help. But the basic Marxist theory of power is that you have a direct level of coercion that includes imperialism. You have the hegemonic layer, which is about, ideology, state propaganda, that kind of thing. And then you have this level of mute compulsion, where we're all under the influence of various kinds of economic forces, whether we acknowledge them or not. And oftentimes even capitalists can feel that they are under compulsion to do something that might be contrary to their conscience or even their long-term interest, because the market is dictating that they do so. So, I'm not going to elaborate on this too much. There are many different examples I give. Why would you not say you are comfortable with identifying with a non-vulgar form of Marxism, or a kind of historical materialism that was fine-grained in its approach to power in the way some of the newer, more interesting kinds of accounts of Marxist theories of power are?
My God, there's so much to say. So I'll try to be brief, but this is an awesome question. So let me first mention that 3 types or 3 sources of Marxism, 3 Marxist schools mostly influenced me, and maybe that'll help us unraveling this answer or question. So firstly, I started off with Marxist political economy, Andrew Kleinman, Michael Roberts, Michael Heinrich, value form theorists, but also not value form theorists, like Andrew Kleinman is a critic of value form theory. And that was mostly economics, so the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, organic capital, stuff like that. And I moved on from that because I saw, like you said, both of you, Matt and Ben, most contemporary Marxists don't have much to do with value theory or the labor theory of value in general, and that just seemed a dead end to me. So I moved on from that. And the second school was analytical Marxism, especially Vivek Chibber and Eric Olin Wright, but also other guys like Gintis and Bowles and people like that. And those guys are, Frank Parkin, a neo-Weberian sociologist, said 50 years ago in a debate with Eric Olin Wright, when Wright was still almost a student, Frank Parkin said, in every neo-Marxist, and Wright is a neo-Marxist, in every neo-Marxist there is a neo-Weberian struggling to get out. And I think he, in a positive sense, you turn it into a negative, but in a positive sense, there was something to that. I think analytical Marxists are, in a sense, Weberians. Vivek Chibber got that from a few more orthodox Marxists in his after his book Post-Colonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital came out. They said, what is this one-sided English Weberian analytical Marxism? This is not true Marxism. So I think there is a tension. Analytical Marxists, I think, in part, dragged me over to Weber. And then the last thing I would say is, I mostly enjoyed the works from 2015 on, the works of political Marxists. So people like Ellen Maxine Wood, Robert Brenner, Charlie Post, Vivek Chiber is also, let's say, a political Marxist, Ben Oteshki, Hannes Lacher, and so on. And again, I mean, political Marxists, in a sense, they're extremely sophisticated. The historical analysis they do just perfect, empirically, theoretically. But when I think to myself, wait, when we are explaining the Norman Conquest or the First Crusade or something like that, or the European Holy Wars, with reference to horizontal class relations, and we're saying that one religious schism attacked another one, not really so much so because they wanted to get surplus out of them, but these are two parts of the ruling class, and this is a class struggle of sorts. Guys, aren't we just doing Weberianism with extra steps? So in a sense, to not drag this out for too long, maybe in my response to Ben, I can tease a few of these things in more detail. I would say that in large part, Marxists themselves made me realize over the years, damn, I mean, I'm doing this non-reductive Marxism. Is this even still Marxism anymore? What would Derona Samoglu, or what would the sophisticated neo-Weberians like Giddens and Men, what would they say? They would say, Tibor, I mean, okay, sure, you can call it Marxism, but we also have been writing like that from the 70s on. We, Weberians. So I guess that would sort of answer it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's funny because I often identify as a historical materialist and a kind of Marxist from the standpoint of evaluating systems of power and social systems, but Rawlsian kind of normatively. But I always say that, I am a historical materialist in the last instance. That's my cheat, the always in that famed last instance. That way I can talk about the ideational level, the cultural level, and talk about it in these kind of determinative ways, but still identify with the label. Sure. Maybe I should rethink that myself. So Ben, what I wanted to do in our discussion was kind of invert the trajectory of these questions. So can you talk a little bit about how you understand the limitations of Marxism? Because I know from discussion that you also have criticisms of what we might broadly call orthodox, certainly vulgar Marxism, before moving on to why it is that you would still characterize Capital as one of your favorite books. Oh, Ben, you're muted.
I'm muted.
So I am. Yeah. Okay. So it was about criticisms of Marx, and then then why I still think that there's an overall framework there that still makes sense to me. Why I like Capital, taught class on Capital. I'm probably like a little bit of a religious zealot about Capital. That's why. Albeit a slightly heretical one. Why is that in the face of it? So okay, so first on the limits of Marxism, I would just say, just schematically, we have to ask first the limits of what. So what are we talking about? We talk about Marxism, because if it's the limits of like everything that Karl Marx ever said, then that's a lot of stuff. Marx took an interest in everything, and wrote at least a little bit about most subjects, chess, algebra, that's
I don't know this, but apparently, according to Terry Eagleton, he wrote really bad Shakespeare-inflected poetry near the end of his life in the 70s and 80s.
I didn't know that either. Didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it's cute. I would probably read it.
I know he loved Shakespeare, and that he and his daughters would like act out Shakespeare plays around the fireplace and stuff. But yeah, look, I think that when people are talking about Marxism, by and large, they're talking about two things usually: a theory of history and a theory of capitalism. The theory of history can be subdivided into a theory of the stages of history, which really for Marx are modes of production, feudalism, capitalism, all that stuff, and a theory of historical change. How is it that how is it that you go from one to another? And I guess if you want to be really cute, you can say the entire theory of capitalism, which is just, part of the theory of historical stages. So it's all one big thing, but, really, I think it's probably useful to talk about these somewhat separately, since the lion's share of his intellectual energy is spent on the theory of capitalism, with capital. So taking those in order, the theory of history, I think the limits of it. I mean, I was actually thinking about the limits when I was listening to Tibor's answer, because I'm actually not that worked up about, whether like an explanation of the Crusades or World War I or etc. is a fully, Marxist explanation or not. Because I don't take that to be the sort of primary aim of a Marxist theory of history. In other words, book that's influenced me a lot, and and I said in my response to Tibor, I'm pretty sure influenced him a lot, even though he didn't end up having time to talk about it in the Areo article. So Space Limitations is G.A. Cohen's Karl Marx's theory of history. And Cohen says something that is fun and arguably a little evasive, fair enough, at the beginning of the book, where he says, this is a theory, of whatever part of history you can reasonably have a theory of, which is more than none of it and less than all of it. So that's like kind of a jokey punt at the beginning, right? But I think that the sort of more precise thing to say is that, certainly if you think about the stuff that Marx says, that's usually taken as like the kind of, definitive statements of the theory of history. So in particular, the 1859 preface. Anybody who read Tibor's article, he quotes some of this in here, where he talks about how the development over time of the forces of production of society's capacity to produce stuff ultimately drives changes in the relations of production, whether you have lords and serfs, capitalists and workers, whatever, and that the superstructure, which for Marx, I think a lot of people who sort of know a little bit about Marxism but less Marx are surprised by this. Marx only uses the word superstructure to talk about legal and political institutions, not ideology, but that's in some important sense built on top of the foundation of these economic relations. And in that account, he's not saying, "Hey, this is going to be, what I'm telling you here is going to be a code key for everything that's ever happened in all of history." He's saying, "I'm going to tell you why you have given, like a given set of relations, right? A given mode of production, just defined by class relations at a given time in history." And then the legal and political institutions that fall out of that. So I think it's fair to say that if he's right about that, right, if he's right about the sort of question of how it is that modes of production rise and fall over time, then most likely I think there are some common sense reasons to think that if it's really true that on this huge question, these factors play a big role, or play the decisive role, final instance, whatever, then that it's reasonable to suppose that that they're also going to be, they're also going to tell us important things about a lot of other subjects. I think that's like a fair assumption. But I don't really like, I don't really lose a lot of sleep over like, okay, do I think that, my explanation of the reason that, Russia invaded Ukraine is like a Marxist explanation or whatever, right? Like I think, most things that happen are incredibly messy and complicated and multi-causal, and some of the factors that are going to be relevant at that view from 10,000 feet view level are going to play in to explanations of these things, but I don't think that it necessarily, I think that I'm pretty comfortable saying like it's not the case that like everything always has to be explained in these terms. I mean, I'm kind of reminded of Trotsky's comment about people who, like Marxist literary critics who think every poem has to have a material, explanation, right? I don't think even like every historical event necessarily needs to have an explanation in sort of terms of sort of grandiose historical materialist terms. I think things happen for a lot of reasons. So that's one limitation on and that's, granted that might not be in the spirit of the question, because I'm sort of saying that's like really a limitation on like what a lot of Marxists have said more than what Marx himself necessarily said, although he certainly did give he certainly did write about different things that were happening in his time or previous times, in ways that it's not like I don't get where it comes from, right? In Marx, this impulse to sort of explain everything in these terms, right? But I think his theory of history per se, right, doesn't necessarily demand that. I think maybe a more substantive limitation that's like actually a limitation on Marx that is really, is that, Tibor talked earlier about value theory, and I am really truly agnostic about what's true about value theory. This is just because I know that there are people who are watching who are not at all familiar with these debates, and I don't want to give a misleading impression. I should say, so when people hear phrases like the labor theory of value, they hear a lot.
Just go on Twitter and post the labor theory of value is bunk. Can't believe anybody would possibly believe on it. And every single Yankee on Twitter will be on you in about 30 minutes. Just put your phone away, go watch an episode of, whatever it is that you want to, brew a coffee, come back, and just wait till you see what
Yeah.
happens.
Fair enough. Not just the Yankees. Yeah. So yeah, look, I think, so people hear a lot of things when they hear that phrase. So the people that you're talking about in many cases are going to be like, Marxists who've really done the reading and are very mad at anybody who comes to different conclusions about it from them. But like also a lot of people who are sort of casual kind of grassroots socialists hear the phrase labor theory of value, and what they hear is oftentimes two things that aren't really at all what we're arguing about, right? One is a labor theory of stuff that has value, that workers are like workers produce stuff in ways that capitalists typically do not, or at least, or if they do, it's sort of not built in to their position that they're doing it. And a related thing is a labor theory of entitlement, that workers have some sort of claim on the products that they produce because they produce them. And neither of these things really has anything to do with what we're talking about when we talk about value theory. We can have interest in arguments about both of those two things, but they're just separate subjects from theory of value in this sense that is very hard to pin down. There is a giant literature.
If I could just interject, people often misconstrue Marxist theory of value as essentially a Lockean theory of value, in the sense that workers are the ones who create all the value through their labor, and so they're entitled to the product of their labor, the value that they create. Actually, Marx chastised Ricardian socialists for making exactly this kind of conflation, and very stringently in Capital Volume 1 said, I know that you might think that my theory looks like this, and in some sense it borrows from Ricardian socialism, since I was also influenced by Ricardo, but socially necessary labor time is a different concept entirely, just to be a little clear on that.
Yeah, and what Locke is giving you is really a labor theory of entitlement that's again, like, whatever you either think is true about the entitlement question, and whatever you think Marx said about the entitlement question, and however those two subjects are related for you, it's all just a different question, right? From value, in this sense that, almost the only thing that people can agree on is that it's different from price. What it is exactly that's different from price is an immensely complicated question. if you read, for chapter 1 of Capital, Marx starts out talking about exchange ratios, that you can get this many, ears of corn for this many yards of linen, and then something or other that's underlying those, but, can really come apart from actual market value, and but it's still supposed to play some sort of explanatory role. Giant question, giant literature on this. I am pretty. I actually think, ironically, Tibor is better read in this literature than I am. I don't. I'm not entirely sure what to think about that. It's a huge question, and having been convinced a long time ago by Jacobin that Marx's exploitation argument is logically independent of whatever's true about love value theory, I pretty much don't worry about it. I think that some claims about like falling rate of profit, which Tibor mentions in his article, really might rely on value theory, but I'm also that itself is disputed, because almost every sentence you could say about this is disputed. But I'm also not too worried about that, because I sort of, people who are really fixated on the falling rate of profit always kind of end up reminding me of Jehovah's Witnesses, who keep putting off the predicted date at the end of the world. They realize they forgot to carry a 2 somewhere, and I'm just not that. That's not necessarily the part of Marxist theory that most speaks to me, or that that I'm most invested, right? So I think those are two big limitations. I've been talking for a really long time, so I'll just say in just super briefly that as to why, nevertheless, why.
Well, actually, if I could ask my question, because I think you're going to answer it anyway, because I gave Tibor a bit of a critical question, so you have to get one also. So listen, I think that's a very comprehensive and sophisticated response to some critics of Marxism. But just to kind of emphasize Tibor's point for him a little bit, and then what you guys discuss. Yeah, absolutely. There are defenses you can make of every aspect of the theory of historical materialism and the theory of value. In his letter to Bloch, Engels famously said, listen, Marx and I never intended to say that all you need to do is look at economic relations and explain why this poem or that poem was produced. That's completely nonsensical. All we were trying to do was foreground the centrality of economic relations, in no small part because bourgeois economists and bourgeois political apologists were so keen to deny the importance of economics and economic relations. But all we were trying to do is talk about how these things are explanatory in the last instance. That's where that famous phrase comes from. And I tend to sympathize with this approach myself. That's why I identify as a historical materialist. But if you were Tibor, you might say, well, listen, if all this does is have explanatory power in the last instance, or it doesn't even have explanatory power in the last instance, why not just jettison the historical materialist label? Say, I'm approaching historical materialism like some conceptual toolbox. I'll draw from it what I need to, but I won't identify with that in some kind of Catholic sense of the word. And then, the other kind of major contribution of Marxist theory, according to Engels, was the labor theory of value, right? Or his theory of value, excuse me. And you and I and Tibor would probably all agree that there's really just no saving that, or at least it's extremely problematic. Now, I'm not convinced that my Marxism needs the labor theory of value to be significant, because I've largely never been very invested in defending that approach. But, there's no doubt that in many people's minds, this idea of exploitation on the basis that capitalists are extracting surplus value was what Marxism was about. And if you take that away, a lot of it is chucked or gone. So how would you respond to these kinds of criticisms? And why would you still identify with Marx, given that you're skeptical on the labor theory of value point, and you adopt this soft historical materialism of the kind that Tibor himself seems to be arguing for?
Yeah, so I think that, starting with the historical materialism component of the question, I do suspect that there is actually a big difference between Tibor and I on historical materialism, despite the overlap. So if the question is why did World War I happen, or not just like, I don't know, why are there wars, but like, why did World War I happen? Or what's what's the I don't know, what's the reason the United States became much more secular in the last 100 years, or whatever. You just like pick some interesting question about history. Then probably there is going to be quite a bit of overlap between Tibor and I, because I'd say, well, look, I think there's a conceptual toolbox here that's going to certainly give you things that are going to be illuminating, but I'm not really that emotionally invested in whether this is sort of like the explanation of any of these things or not, right? I mean, I think it's going to probably tell us some informative things, but that's but I tend to think most things that happen have incredibly messy, multi-causal, contingent explanations, and so I'd be very Tiborish on all that. Where I suspect that we Tibor, my apologies. This is not your fault, but every time I say that name, I have to suppress laughter because there's a joke in The Simpsons.
I know. It's totally fine.
Okay. Yes, that's the foreign coworker who Homer blames for everything. So that idiot Tibor lost the key again. I think on that I would be, but I also think that one of the sort of that like the most important probably question you can ask about any given society is what the relations of production are, and I do think that there's an important sense in which those really profoundly shape what kinds of legal and political institutions you can get. The metaphor that Cohen uses a lot in Karl Marx's theory of history that I find very informative is thinking about like Darwinian evolution, that you can have. It's not that there's a sort of one-to-one between environment and feature that of an organism that that adapts it to that environment, but but it is nevertheless still true that the sort of most important thing you can say, and like why does this creature have this this feature, is that it helps them to survive in this environment, that it's the environment selects for certain features, even if there are, even within the same species, multiple evolutionary strategies, and then very slight different, variations, and you can get really wildly different evolutionary strategies, and features that you had before that can become adapted in new ways, and etc. Right? But I still think that I still find that really explanatory for that question, and there's at least an aspect of the primacy claim that the development of the forces is going to shape the possibilities about the relations that I think is just absolutely correct, and I think that there's a sort of way of describing all this that's really goes to to your why am I why am I not just semi-Weberian, blah blah blah, right? Why would I still defend the Marxist theory of history? That I think that I do basically think it's true that in at an extremely low level, at the lowest possible level of the forces of production, you pretty much are going to have something like primitive communism, because you just don't have the carrying capacity for a ruling class that doesn't work. That with the agricultural revolution, you have like everybody needs to be hunting and gathering, or there won't be enough food to go around. Right? With the agricultural revolution, you have the possibility of such a ruling class, but only if you're using direct coercion. That to get people to produce, and so you have these various pre-capitalist forms of class relations, and that and that as the forces of production develop, you have, like, I think there are various ways that pressures society to sort of get rid of feudal restrictions on further development, and allows for the emergence of a capitalist class that needs this other kind of labor force that Marx says is doubly free, is legally free to sign employment contracts and such, come and go, rather than being bound to a piece of land, but is also free from any other means of supporting themselves, other than agreeing to sign those contracts. That's where the mute compulsion comes in, and that capitalism finally develops the forces of production to the point that for the first time in history, we have the possibility of egalitarianism plus abundance, that we have the possibility of a society that wouldn't just be sort of, we have so few crumbs that things are sort of relatively egalitarian by default, but that's sort of classless in a much better and much more desirable way, that that for the first time since the agricultural revolution, we wouldn't be divided between a subservient workforce and a ruling class. And I'm for that, and I think if I said all that and then I said, oh, but I'm not a Marxist, people would be very confused, because that sure sounds like Marxism. And just to do like one sentence maybe on Capital, I think if you actually read Capital, I would argue that even though, sorry, that was a total lie, 4 to 5 sentences on Capital. If you actually read Capital, Marx certainly has a version of value theory. What exactly that amounts to, massively controversial. I'm actually less down on it than you guys are. I don't think it's bunk, or it's definitely wrong, or whatever. I'm just not sure what's true about it. I'm agnostic about it. I think, but that's not even the. I mean, look, he certainly has a more sophisticated version of it than earlier theorists, but lots of earlier theorists have some sort of value theory that is, you can see the DNA of, and in Marx's. In a lot of ways, he's just following in the footsteps of the bourgeois economists of his time by assuming that. But I think his central arguments about exploitation, I don't actually think rely on that at all, right? I think that, and I think even if you read Capital, that one of the things you'll find very quickly is that while he certainly does talk about surplus value being extracted from workers, that's not the only level of exploitation he talks about. It's not even the one that necessarily he sort of finds most telling, right? He thinks all these are sort of equivalent, or, kind of given one, you can get the other, whatever. But he also, like, if you read, I think, chapter 25, where he talks about the variable capital fund, that's expressed really just in terms of money, that even if the, and if you, we can get into that, sorry, I'll skip that for now, just for the sake of
in Capital Volume 3, he actually goes on to say that under ideal conditions, there'd be a 1-to-1 ratio between the amount of surplus value that was extracted, profits and prices, right? They would all coincide in some kind of harmonious way. But Volume 1 was only written from the standpoint of capitalists who engaged in production, whereas Capital Volume 3, which is looking into the finance market and the way prices are set in international markets, establishes that the ratio between prices, prices, the extraction of surplus value, labor is entirely out of whack because of all the distorting effects of the finance market.
Yeah,
that's a transformation problem in chapter 10. The transformation problem. So yeah, sure.
Yeah. But the point I just want to emphasize is that the dimension of exploitation that Marx is most keen to emphasize is about neither money nor value, although both of those are related, but time. That really what Marx thinks exploitation sort of is at the sort of deepest and most telling level is forced hours of unpaid labor, which he thinks is something that goes on under feudalism, it goes on under slavery, it goes on in a different way under capitalism, but that whoever the immediate producers are, there's a certain number of hours a week that they'd have to work regardless of the social system, just given the current level of technology, this is how much they'd have to work to meet their own needs. But then given the social system, they also have to work these extra hours to enrich the boss. And he thinks that given, workers not having possession of the means of production, that's essentially involuntary. And I would argue that whole claim about time, stands or falls independently of whatever is true about value theory, and that too I would subscribe to. And that's really where I think I'm actually kind of in the opposite position to Tibor. Tibor sort of saying, okay, look, at this point, do I have so little left that it's like, what am I saying that's really different from what some neo-Weberian kind of sociologist would be saying? So like, I might as well stop calling myself a Marxist. I would kind of say, well, look, if I'm going to sort of defend that claim about history I just defended, I'm going to defend that claim about exploitation and labor time and everything I just defended. But, I said, no, but I'm defending all that, but I'm not a Marxist. Like, that would sort of sound disingenuous in the other direction.
Okay, good. So I had a follow-up question that would allow us to lead into the more general kinds of questions about this. I should also say that, who identifies as a Marxist, who gets labeled as a Marxist really depends a great deal on your point of view. I would identify as a kind of Rawlsian Marxist. Tibor would probably not identify as a Marxist anymore, said he's not identifying as a Marxist anymore, even though he's a democratic socialist or social democrat. But from Jordan Peterson's standpoint, or, Mark Levin's standpoint, we're all Marxist, right? Everything is Marxist. That's, not hard right. So, what's in a word name? The question that I want to give to you moves us in a bit more of a normative direction towards praxis. So one definition of
Matt, sorry to jump in. Sorry, Matt. I was bursting at the seams. I have so much to say to Ben. Would you allow me to maybe take 6 minutes to respond to those claims, and then we get into the normative component?
Let me ask my question and then try to incorporate this in, because we.
Okay, that would make sense.
We're also running out of time.
I would say, because I know. So maybe just remove economic freedom indexes. I mean, that is just a debate maybe for some other time. This, I think, it really opened up a fruitful discussion.
I'm pretty friendly to that. I have. So Matt, do you want to stay with the more theoretical stuff right now and save economic freedom indexes for a future appearance? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think that's fine, right? So I'm just going to ask my question very quickly, because I do want you to kind of incorporate this into your response, because it's a very polemical question. So Christine Sipnowicz, in her book, The Concept of Socialist Law, just says, look, a socialist is just somebody, this is the simple reduction of review, but who is a partisan for the working classes, right? So all this stuff about historical materialism, all the stuff about the labor theory of value aside, if you are concerned, first and foremost, for theorizing on behalf of, let's use the Rawlsian term, the least well off, you can identify with the label. And I'm, to a certain extent, attracted to this. It has a nice kind of reductive side to it. And this is what I want to ask you, Tibor, right? Given that a lot of your work focuses on poverty, people who are in hard-struck situations, trying to find a way to alleviate their kind of condition, would you say that you identify very broadly with the socialist label? And if so, what's the problem with saying that there are good aspects to Marx and Marxism if they do provide us with conceptual tools that will allow us to answer the kinds of problems or develop the kind of theories that Ben is talking about?
Sure. So first, I would say that I don't like right, like Eric Olin Wright. I no longer see Marxism as an overarching paradigm that would be in rivalrous combat with bourgeois sociology. Like this is something like that Wright put down in the 80s, I think. He thought that the Marxist knight will unseat the bourgeois knight, lances drawn, and then the bourgeois knight will switch horses as a result of all these analytical arguments in favor of Marxism, and every good social scientist will have to become Marxist, like every good evolutionary biologist is a Darwinian, or every good physicist is a quantum mechanic, and so on. So I would say, sure, if you see Marxism pragmatically, this is what Wright, before he died, unfortunately, said that he over the past 40 years has been drawn to. That is the idea that Marxism is a loose assemblage of various mechanisms and concepts that can be freely drawn upon by other non-Marxists. And he even says that Weberians have the easiest way of doing that, because Weberians were never, and here I'm also responding partly to Ben, Weberians were never against the notion of exploitation. Weber himself, and definitely neo-Weberians, they think capitalism is exploitative. They think that feudalism is exploitative. They don't talk about surplus value extraction, but they talk about surplus extraction. They talk about the disjointed bargaining power between workers, and absolutely. So first, yes, definitely. Now, the question was also about socialism. So this is about Marxism, now about socialism. I don't know. A socialist is somebody who's amenable to the requests and the wishes and the wants of those who are most most poor or least well off. I guess that's kind of maybe, but that's kind of unfair to conservatives and libertarians and everybody else who definitely are not this caricature of a villain who wants to destroy the poor. I mean, maybe Jordan Peterson,
maybe Peter Thiel,
but in general, or definitely Peter Thiel. But in general, ordinary conservatives just have the wrong empirical notions about what will help the working class. So pragmatically, okay, sure, I guess. But I think that, like you said, it's too reductive. I wouldn't go that far. But in principle, maybe. Now let me go back to Ben. So I addressed the Weberian exploitation thing. Let me make 2 points. One about the theory of history, which I think Ben is completely correct, that this is such an important, a central piece of this whole discussion. And also the other thing about maybe even without the theory of history, like you said, Matt, maybe you're still a Marxist, not because you think that every single phenomenon can be at the macro and the micro level explained by a reference to class relations, but in general, you put much more weight on class relations than Weberians, who again, Weberians think that sometimes class relations are important, sometimes political relations, and so on, but nothing has primacy. Maybe you think that they're not determinative as a Marxist, but they just have this vague primacy. I will address that as well. So the theory of history. Ben is correct that Cohen produced not just the most famous, but a brilliant and elegant exposition of Marxism, the best we had, the most rigorous we have.
Oh, that's for sure.
And this has fueled whole research programs. Analytical Marxism came out of that. So what Cohen says correctly, I think, is that there are two main theses, like Ben already mentioned. I'll just summarize it extremely briefly. Two main theses to Marxist theory of history: the development thesis and the primacy thesis. The development thesis says that there is a tendency for the forces of development, for the forces of production to develop through history. This is Marxist jargon for technology or the productive capacity of the society, land, firms, tools, and so on. And the primacy thesis, now this is more important, the primacy thesis claims that the economic structure of each society that we have at each stage in human history is explained by the beneficial consequences of that economic structure for the development of the forces of production. Now, note importantly, this is a functionalist argument, and Cohen goes to great lengths in the book and in the subsequent articles to say Marxism as a theory of history is functionalist to its core. If functionalism falls, Marxism is irrevocably damaged, because it's I have a quote here just very quickly. I believe that historical materialism's central explanations are unrevisably functional in nature, so that if functional explanations is unacceptable in social theory, then historical materialism cannot be reformulated and must be rejected. So everything hinges upon that. He had a discussion with his co-author or a friendly analytical Marxist named John Elster. People can find that on the internet in the 80s. Very fruitful discussion on both parts. And what happens is the following. Elster says correctly that you need if you're going to make functionalist claims, you need a mechanism that will act as a feedback loop, connecting the beneficial consequences of the economic structure of the event that is to be explained back to this same event. You can just say we have feudalism, or we have capitalism, or we've transitioned from feudalism to capitalism because this is the most propitious for the development of force of production. That could be a coincidence. You have to show that these beneficial consequences resolve back into this transition, that they are explanatory for the transition. So everything, I think, hinges on that. Cohen says in a reply to the debate, you're right. No, not you're right, Elster. He says, so I stand by my functionalist credentials, but Elster, you're wrong. I don't need I don't know any functional any mechanisms that would act as a feedback loop, but I don't need that. I can cite so-called consequence laws, and those laws, even without the knowledge of mechanism, are enough to establish the validity, if they are actually empirically true, these consequence laws, the validity of historical materialism. Elster, right. Levin, Sober, Chibber, I learned this from Marxists. All of them maintain, no, you're wrong. If you're going to venture functionalist claims, you need a mechanism that will act as a feedback loop. Think of Darwinian evolutionary biology, functionalist to its core. Nothing wrong with functionalist arguments. Why do giraffes have long necks? Not because the preceding events caused them to happen, this would be normal causal explanation, but because of the beneficial consequences of the long necks on the reproductive success of giraffes. But there we have a empirically verified and theoretically robust mechanism called natural selection, which consists of many conditions, phenotypic variation, high fidelity mechanism of heredity, and so on. So functionalism is okay in Darwinian evolutionary biology. But in social science, it's not, unless you get a mechanism. Now, there are two ways out of the impasse for Cohen or for Marxist theory of history. One way is to actually adduce such a mechanism that would act as a causal feedback loop. And this is what's been done in the 90s and the 2000s by Alan Carling and Paul Noland, two Marxists, in various publications, in a book, in a piece for the Historical Materialism Journal, and so on. And they say, we got your back, Cohen. Again, they agreed, Elster, you need a mechanism, but they think they found a mechanism. The mechanism is called geopolitical competition. They adduce a few assumptions, they add a few assumptions to Cohen's rendition of Marx, and they say, if we assume that there is constant conflict between societies, between modes of production, if we assume that we have these quote-unquote random mutations, various new modes of production are constantly springing up, a little capitalism here, a little feudalism there, constantly throughout history, and if we assume that these different modes of production are differently propitious for the development of forces of production, and lastly, if we assume that these different levels of forces of production have a determinative influence on how the geopolitical competition goes, that is, who is the victor, then over time you will have selection, akin to Darwinianism, but without genes or something like that. The problem with that is that, to my mind, that is completely satisfactory. Empirically, logically perfectly works. Empirically, it doesn't work. And Carling and Tibor and other Marxists write, they say, wow, this is a fantastic mechanism. This actually corroborates Cohen or makes Cohen's rendition of Marx. It actually works now. It has a motor, but it's not empirically feasible. In pre-capitalist societies, the differences in the level of development of productive forces are not enough so that one side would easily prevail over the other. You have another way, and then I'm finished. You have another way out of this dilemma, and this is what Cohen opted for. That is, you can surrender the functionalist underpinnings of Marxism, and he did that. He didn't admit it in so many words, but again, Marxists read Tibor's review article or Alan Carling's rendition of Cohen. They agree with me. So he has an intentionalist mechanism. He says in his book and in his later articles with Will Kimlicka and so on, he says, look, it is an artifact of human nature that people want to lessen the burden of their toil, which I think is correct, by the way. And because one of the main ways of going about lessening the burden of your toil is by developing technology, because that increases the productivity, and increases in productivity simply mean that you can produce more output with the same labor effort. You can then reduce your labor effort, but still produce the same amount of output as before. And so you lessen the burden of toil. Now, that doesn't work. First of all, it's not a functionalist argument, so Cohen is contradicting himself. And secondly, empirically, it doesn't work. Wright, Tibor, and Carling have taught me that in class societies, the ruling class will have a vested interest in exploiting peasants or workers, even when they increase their productive capacity, and they say, okay, I'm just going to sit back now, I'm going to work half as much and produce the same output as before because I have these new tools. The feudal lord will walk over and say, what are you doing? You have to work the same amount as before. I know you've become more productive, but this just means more surplus for me, the feudal lord. So that wouldn't pan out, I think. And so in that sense, I think that Ben is mistaken, but we can suss that out a bit more. Ben is mistaken when he says that Marxist theory of history is broadly correct. I'd say it's broadly wrong. If you read Wright's and Levin's and Sober's Reconstructing Marxism, a book from the early 90s, they make all these points that I make right now, but they try to formulate the so-called weak historical materialism. I won't go into what that means right now. And I think that their defense of weak historical materialism is correct. Yeah, sure, it is correct. But the price that has been paid is a significant downshifting of ambitions of historical materialism, so much so that Cohen himself was dismayed by this weakening of historical materialism, but his colleague, Eric Wright.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive answer. Actually, it's interesting. My wife's PhD supervisor, Hans Locker, was also one of the major theorists who actually talked about materialist relations at international level and how it is that was determinative of the different forms of modes of production that emerge in different countries, because he emphasized that
he's an awesome political Marxist. One of my heroes, I would say, Hannes Lacher. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, then I'll let her know that, because his book was very interesting. But let's move on, because there are a lot of different aspects to your presentation that Ben will have to respond to. So why don't you keep it to 2-3 minutes, Ben, and then I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions that maybe will break the discussion up a little bit into more manageable bites.
Sure. So the reason that I was starting to do the and Tibor dropped so many references that I find myself reverting to acting like I'm not on a podcast, but I'm like at a Q&A session, and I'm doing this like one finger thing. They say that it's like not a full question. It's just it's just a quick point that Cohen, there are two different words here that, like, this is probably going to sound like almost a joke to people who haven't read the book or aren't familiar with this, to say that the distinction between them matters, but I actually do think the distinction between them matters. One is functional and the other is functionalist. And Cohen is actually at great pains in Karl Marx's theory of history to say he's not giving a functionalist theory, and to differentiate what he's saying from functionalism. Now, maybe you don't think that matters. Maybe you think that the kind of functional explanations that he's giving are problematic for the same reasons that full-fledged functionalism would be. But I just, I can't not say that when this comes up. As far as mechanism goes, so for the sake of adhering to the time limit, I just want to really quickly say, so I think there are two different kinds of arguments you can have here, right? One is a sort of methodological argument about, like, how much mechanism do you need to have spelled out in order to, in order for it to be kosher to give an explanation of this kind, that, like, because surely in our ordinary reasoning we often do, sort of think we have enough evidence that things are causally linked without being able to spell out everything, and so Cohen has at various stages this insistence that that this falls into that category. But I would also point out that in a certain sense he's underselling himself, because even in the original book he does actually say a good amount about mechanism. Now, he doesn't say anything about mechanism that would that would sort of add up to, I mean, if the standard is sort of something as robust as, like, as Darwinian natural selection, no. I mean, I also think, frankly, for a theory of history, I'm not sure that's where the bar can be set. But but he does say quite a few things about different partial mechanisms, and I tend to think that the most plausible thing to say about this is that it's not one thing, that there are actually several different causal pathways leading from a system doing a better job of developing the forces of production to it leading to it becoming more dominant than other systems, and this okay, so I would say, like, in that Chibber article that Tibor mentioned, called something like "What is Alive and What's Dead in Marxist Theory of History." I think that's not exactly it, but it's very, very close. It's in there, like, he really emphasizes this evidence, originally from Brenner, about the foundations of capitalism in England, and essentially the claim is, the claim is that the sort of way that capitalism first arose in England had to do with, like, extremely low contingent local factors about the aftermath of the Black Plague and all of that, and so this looks like just a very different explanation from this one about the forces of production. And what I've long thought about this is that it actually depends, and I think, to be totally call balls and strikes about this, I think Cohen is too ambiguous about this, and I think he even later admits somewhere. I mean, his former student Steve Paxton told me this. I haven't actually seen it in writing, right? But that Cohen sort of responded to somebody else making essentially the same point I'm going to end with, yeah, that's what I meant. It's like, okay, well, you really should have spelled that out, right? But they're just two different questions, and I think until we get to the broader debates, just it's easier to run them together. One is how, like, sticking to the specific context of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. One question is, how did capitalism get its first foothold in the world? And then the second question is, how did capitalism come to be the overwhelmingly dominant mode of production on the entire planet? Such that, you know, you kind of have to go to North Korea or that island where they're always shooting arrows at missionaries to find, you know, really robust islands of non-capitalism in the world today. That just everything else is just totally smashed to smithereens. And I think if you're asking the first question, then sure, I'm pretty comfortable with saying it's messy, multi-causal. There's going to be like weird local contingent stuff that's going to help you explain that. But if it's the second question, yeah, that seems to have everything to do with the way that capitalism is so much better than other systems at unleashing the forces of production. I think the negative example is that, you know, I mean,
2 minutes is up. 2 minutes is up.
2 minutes is most definitely up, so I'm going to stop.
Okay. So we do.
Can I just 1 minute?
1 minute.
Literally.
Okay. 1 minute. So very quick.
Ben, I completely agree. I said in my PhD, and I stand by that still today, Cohen's theory of history works as a theory of capitalism or capitalist transition. And this is something that Alan Carling says. And the mechanism is geopolitical competition. In my book, I try to make a materialist, Marxist, maybe even sounding argument that capitalism spread, it was created contingently and then spread throughout the world because it's so much more productive that it forced Napoleonic France and Germany and so on to adopt social. But in pre-capitalist world, that doesn't work because the differentials between ancient Rome and feudalism in the level of technological sophistication are not enough.
I can see why you like Hans. Anyway, so I want us to transition towards the kind of bigger picture stuff at the end of this discussion. And obviously, for our sequel, there's always got to be a sequel with my discussions with Ben. I mean, how many analyses of the Jordan Peterson debate did we do? It's like a 4-part series. So I want us to move on to talking a little bit about contemporary politics. And we'll save the stuff about the Fraser Institute data for later on. So we'll start with you, Tibor, and then we'll move on to Ben. So in your book, you acknowledge that there are a wide array of problems with contemporary capitalism. And part of the realist dimension of your title is that you want defenders of capitalism and apologists for capitalism to be clear-eyed about those limitations. But you also kind of direct some flack on the other front to unreconstructed Marxists and to a certain extent democratic socialists who are kind of doom and gloom about capitalism. And think that, yeah, maybe it did a fairly good job of developing the forces of production. We should give it credit for that, like good Marxists. But nonetheless, you know, we should be 90% critical of the system. Because you say, actually, in practice, capitalism does some very good things. So can you talk to us a little bit about this dynamic? What do you think are wrong? What do you think is wrong with contemporary capitalism? What do you think works about contemporary capitalism? And in an ideal magic wand kind of scenario, what would your new world order? That's a loaded term now. What would it look like?
I think the biggest thing that's wrong with capitalism or markets in general, competitive markets that is, we should stick with capitalism. Markets have existed since time immemorial. Definitely climate change. Externalities are not internalized spontaneously on the market. Market actors don't spontaneously take account of environmental destruction if it's not part of the price. So that's one thing. That's not completely the fault of capitalism. Even non-capitalist systems like real existing socialism, like the Soviet Union, had the same problems, even though it didn't have competitive markets. This is a tragedy of the commons that happens because people are rational actors, although that needs a whole lot of unpacking, and I'm not a naive rational choice theorist. So that's one thing. The other thing is perhaps I'd say definitely the discrepancy in bargaining power between workers and capitalists. Capitalists are so much more powerful on average than workers. That is why capitalists are exploited under workers are exploited under capitalism. We have
why even I think Ben is too soft. You know, I would send the red yard after little girl with the lemonade stand. I can't let it spread up anywhere.
Exactly. Yeah, that's how it starts. So that's another thing. We have to remedy that bargaining power. I think that can be remedied under capitalism with collective, centralized bargaining or sectoral bargaining like in the Nordic countries. But definitely that thing. Also, it's simply not the case. I mean, Marxists are wrong when they say, look, you either work or you starve. You most definitely do not starve, especially not in contemporary social democratic societies. You've got loads of other options. Are they usually, if you're uneducated and so on, are they shitty? Are they shitty in a recession where the unemployment level is high and nobody is hiring? Absolutely, they're shitty. You can switch from McDonald's to Burger King or something like that, but you can definitely switch employers, and that does have some protective effects, which Marxists, I think, are too quick to dismiss. But most definitely, we need a universal basic income so that would really level the playing field between workers and capitalists. Now, on the other hand, and I'm winding down my answer now, on the other hand, I'd say that capitalism, and this is now I have a new paper out. It's still under review, so it's not out, but I've written it with loads of data, historical data, skeletal high data, welfare subsistence ratios for 15th and 16th century, measured directly, not by proxy, so through GDP, which is distortionary, but directly of wages of unskilled craftsmen and so on, unskilled workers and craftsmen. And what we see is this clear tendency that where capitalism first developed in England and then spread in the 18th and 19th century on continental Europe, before that you have this stagnation at extreme poverty level, levels, and then the ordinary person just skyrockets after the Industrial Revolution. You have Engels's pause. Engels's pause is an interesting phenomenon. It lasted for 50 years when the Industrial Revolution got going in England. So there are some anomalies there. But overall, capitalism definitely, not on its own accord, but capitalism definitely, and this is something Marx would agree with me, definitely raises the living standards of even ordinary people tremendously. Now, of course, you need unions also to help with that. You need the welfare state. But even before that, you have this tremendous, unprecedented in history jump. So stuff like that. For the last 60 seconds, what would be my ideal society? I guess I sketched that. When I alluded to Nordic countries, I would just constrain capitalism much more than it's constrained right now. I would make international trade much more free. I would certain regulations I would do away with. Other regulations, especially regulations having to do with labor, I would definitely increase. And one last thing to mention is the size of government. And this is what neoliberals get wrong. You have to have a large government. You have to have high marginal taxation. You have to have lots of social spending. You have to have lots of government consumption, even some government investment maybe. So when we see that in correlations, you can look at correlations in the index, which we'll talk to we'll talk about in a later session. You can correlate homicide rates and size of government. The smaller your government, the more neoliberal it is, the more homicide you get, even controlling for other factors. So that.
Yeah, I would say that many neoliberals were actually quite comfortable with big government, a la Ronald Reagan, as long as it was attacking the right people and imprisoning the right racial groups. But that's another discussion for another time. I can wax poetic about how much I despise neoliberalism at great length, and I know you disagree. But Ben, somewhat of a different question, right? Obviously, you are much more unambiguously critical of capitalism. I'd imagine you wouldn't want to even give 2 cheers, maybe 1 cheer, kind of half-hearted Marxist cheer for developing the modes of production. But can you say what you think, why it is that you think the struggle against contemporary capitalism, however it is that you want to define that, why is that the central struggle of this time? And why would you not qualify your criticisms the way that Tibor would? And again, a couple sections at the end. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the solutions would be contemporaneously, and why we need to go a little bit further than Tibor's, Nordic style social democracy with a UBI and probably better weather if you live in California?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people on the right who think that the weather has something to do with it, since there's this continual search for explanations of why life is better in those countries, and the outcomes are so much better that looks for everything except for the giant welfare state of the strong unions as a possible explanation. I remember Nathan Robinson telling me, it's like he's like making fun of this. It's like, oh no, it's the fjords. The fjords are, what lead to all the positive consequences.
The fact that they eat all that seafood, right?
yeah, exactly. Okay, so look, I hope this isn't cheating too much, but I think this is a way of like framing it as an answer to one of your questions at the beginning. I think how many cheers to give to capitalism depends on what stage of history you're in. I think if you're in the 16th century, to Tibor's point about the data about improving outcomes, then sure, yeah, I mean, look, capitalism. The transition from feudalism to capitalism is a very good thing, which Marx himself, of course, as Tibor acknowledged, definitely thought, and I agree. I think the bourgeois revolution is a tremendous leap forward in human freedom. It's just not good enough. We need to have we can't stop there. And I did just want to really briefly, parenthetically, go to the point about the options and, working or starving. Now, of course, it is certainly true. In fact, most true at the point where capitalism was most of a progressive force, that sort of raw capitalism, those really are your choices. You work or you starve. There's to the extent that it's not now, it's, I think I would argue largely a function of, the gains won past worker struggles. But I also, I would also point out that even Tibor's explanation, and this does, I don't think this is off topic. I think this goes to your question, Matt, about, why I think what I do about capitalism, even Tibor's explanation of the options that people have, isn't actually, work or starve, or, because he's talking about going from working at McDonald's to working at Burger King. You're still working. You're still working for a boss. You're not at a worker-owned firm. You're not.
I worked at McDonald's. I used to dream of working at Burger King because at least you got the grill. That was the thing, right?
Yeah. So now getting to choose which boss is a very good thing. As I said, this tremendous leap forward in human freedom. There's a reason why Marx was so enthusiastic about the Union cause in the Civil War. But getting the choice of boss is a very different thing from having a choice in the basic setup, right? Of being in the subordinate class position. Now, it is true to a certain extent. It really depends. It's a lot less true in the United States than it is in Norway, right? It really depends, but it is true to one extent or another in various advanced capitalist countries that there are other choices now as the sort of some of the most brutal edges of capitalism are sanded off, right? That's not completely true. I would just quickly refer people to a classic paper by Jacobin called The Structure of Proletarian Unfreedom, where I think he makes a good argument that what we usually mean when we say that people are forced to do something is not literally that they have no other options, but they have no other acceptable options. Even the gun in your face, open up the bank vault. Look, you can make a desperate grab for the gun and whatever, but it's not an acceptable choice. And I think that's really what
do the Apu thing and like throw yourself in front of the vault, rather than let your employer down, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think 20 seconds totally off topic, but I just have to say this. I also think I actually agree with Tibor that the transition from feudalism to capitalism is a much clearer case than the transition from whatever you want to call the mode of production in ancient Rome to feudalism. And I would also point out that Cohen kind of says that too, and Karl Marx's theory of history, toward the end of it, although granted, I'm not 100% sure what's in the original edition and what's in the 2000 edition, but he says, so this might be a later thing, I'm not sure, but he definitely does say in that book that, that if you sort of have like a 4-stage schematic with primitive communism and pre-capitalist class society and capitalism and socialism, that's sort of much more defensible, much more easily defensible, certainly, because I think the Rome problem raises a lot of other questions. But that's off topic, so I'll stop talking about it. So why to just go to the nub of the question, because we're getting right to time. Why is it that I disagree with Tibor, and I don't just want the sort of capitalism that he describes? I want non-capitalism. Whatever, like even if we can't completely eliminate market mechanisms or whatever, I do want to at least eliminate capitalist property relations. And God knows, maybe supercomputers read plenty, who knows? But right now, right, want to eliminate capitalist property relations. And I think there are basically two reasons, and both of them maybe take us back to the Nordics. 2.5, maybe. One is that it's certainly true that social democratic reforms and strong unions can lessen the power imbalance between workers and capitalists. That's importantly true, and that's a hugely important reason to support both of those things. What they can't do is eliminate them. That if you are in, not only in, say, Sweden today, but even in Sweden in the 1970s, at the absolute high watermark of Swedish social democracy, when there was serious talk of, trying to do some sort of weird slow motion expropriation of big companies by stock options and stuff. Even in Sweden in the 1970s, never mind Sweden now, it's still the case that there's a significant power imbalance between workers and capitalists. I mean, just the nature of really even pretty small scale production, but especially modern production, where what goes on is the result of the combined efforts of many people working together, and then they're separated from ownership. It just is going to be true that it's going to be easier for a employer to replace any particular worker than for the worker replace the job. And even when it comes to the union itself, I would suggest that, look, it's great if there's strikes and industrial unrest all the time, and this exerts a lot of influence over what goes on in workplaces. But I would suggest that the situation is still somewhat analogous to a weak king who has to worry a lot about protests and riots if people don't like what happens. The king still has a lot more power. There's still this severe power imbalance in that situation. So that's kind of the principal reason that even in the Nordics, even in the sort of most humane societies that have ever existed under capitalism or at all, it's still the case that most people have no acceptable, realistic choice except for to submit themselves to follow orders from people that they don't elect, and et cetera, over to not have control except for the sort of indirect influence through the threat of strikes over how the product of their labor is distributed, et cetera. So that's the principal reason. And the pragmatic reason is that look, if I thought we could get the Tibor world order, then I would look, I'm enough of an ideologue that I would still grumble about it, right, for the reasons that I just said. But I understand that that it would be a much harder sell for me to convince anybody else to do that. But I don't think we could get it under capitalism. I don't think that you could get something you call UBI that supplements people's income a little bit, right? But I think there's a reason why even the Nordics they've accomplished a lot, and it takes a long time to unwind. But there's already been some unwinding of social democratic progress in the Nordic states, and certainly if you had a really robust UBI that was a serious alternative to work, and actually made it so that everybody could live a reasonable life without it and all that stuff. I think that that you'd have to fight so hard to overcome capitalist resistance to that you might just have to expropriate them anyway in the process. So, and I think ultimately, as long as you have this class of owners who have this structural economic power, they're always going to find ways to translate that into political power. And what has been won in the past is always going to be unstable. You always have to refight those battles. They're always going to be trying to roll the boulder back down the hill again, which is why I think ultimately the only way to secure those reforms is to change the property relations. Final point, just this is the half and the 2.5. I'm skeptical that we would have gotten the Nordics in the first place if we didn't have socialist parties that were inspired by a vision of a world after capitalism. And I think that alone, right, is a good enough reason to keep our eyes on the prize.
Okay. Certainly a very interesting discussion. I really enjoyed mediating this debate in no small part because it was a lot more nuanced and a lot more into the weeds than the normal, right? Capitalism has done everything good for us, or capitalism is relentlessly evil kind of stuff that you find on the internet. And also, I'm just going to do a flagrant push for a book that people might enjoy if they're engaged in these discussions around the Nordic model, which is George Leakey's Viking Economics. George Leakey is a sociologist. He's 85 right now. And he talks a lot about the historical basis for the emergence of Scandinavian social democracy, or the Nordic model, as it's sometimes called, and points out that actually quite a lot of it was extremely violent. In fact, several of the countries almost broke out into a civil war before the Great Compact. So it's a fascinating history and a story well worth talking about. So that's all I have for us today.
So sorry, Matt, can I just make 2 book recommendations as well? One on the topic of
everybody gets to make a book recommendation. Tibor, book, Ben, go.
So by the sociologist Lane Kenworthy, one is Social Democratic Capitalism from 2019, I think, and the other one is just recently has been published last year. It's Would Democratic Socialism Be Better? Obviously, in reference to the first book, Social Democratic Capitalism.
Excellent. Go ahead, Ben. Any book recommendations you'd like to make?
I think I'm good. I think my main book recommendation. I think my main 2 book recommendations. I relentlessly talked about. I think Read Karl Marx's Theory of History and Read Capital. If you have to skip the first, this is really going to piss off the Twitter Marxologists. But if you have to skip the first 3 chapters, so you don't get bogged down, most of the good stuff is actually after that. So
yeah, it reminds me. My undergraduate supervisor was a great guy. He was a kind of Marxist international relations scholar. And one night when he was extremely drunk and a little high, he admitted to me that he had never gotten through Capital Volume 2 and Volume 3. And I asked him why, and he's like, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I always find that.
While we're at the topic of admissions, I have to admit that I read Capital Volume 1 book, bookend to bookend, and or cover to cover. I skipped the last, I think, 200 to 300 pages in Volume 2, and I read the first 400 pages of Capital Volume 3, and then just skimmed the rest.
Okay, well, sometime soon, I hope in a couple months, I'm gonna do a Zoom class on Capital Volume 2. So Matt's
okay.
So Matt, get in touch with your old supervisor. Tell him to sign up. So
he's living up in the mountains with a rock and roll band now. So.
Speaking of the mountains, I was in like a couple weeks ago. I spent a couple days. With some visiting family at an Airbnb in Big Bear, so up in the mountains here. And the book that I was reading then that I actually accidentally left in the Airbnb, so now I need to buy a new copy of, is actually one of the ones that Tibor mentioned. It's Reconstructed Marxism.
Oh, wow. Nice. That's an awesome book.
Excellent. Okay, good. So maybe we'll do a follow-up sometime, and we can dive more into that Fraser Institute data.
Let's definitely do a follow-up. We definitely at least need to talk about the Fraser Institute data, and also just remind people, if you're not sick of this debate, you're going to get a new written contribution from Tibor on Sunday.
Excellent. Perfect. So thanks a lot for coming on. Hope you guys had time, and of course, as always, left is best.
All right.
Thanks. See ya. All
right. Yeah, got Got to get Matt's old supervisor in the Capital Volume 2 class. Yeah, no, that was fun. Honestly, you know what? I've never had a bad conversation with a Slovenian. It's only been good ones. So, it's a small sample size, but so far the Slovenians are 2 for 2.
They seem like, I was going to say they seem like a friendly people actually 3 Slovenians I know. I know Luka and Tibor and Zizek, and Luka's definitely one of the more. Yeah, he's definitely one of the more friendly, always smiling basketball players out there. But seriously, that was I always long for more debates between people who are a little closer. You know what I mean? Like who don't disagree on everything. I think maybe when you debate kind of these super hard right people, it's helpful to turn their audience more onto like a more reasonable message. But for left-wing folks, I think it's very helpful. And I already wrote down a few of those books that I can read and then rewatch that debate and know what the fuck you're talking about. For a few of them, he was throwing out a lot of names at some point, but definitely want to check them out.
I mean, definitely Karl Marx's Theory of History. Honestly, it's a pretty it's a pretty accessibly. I mean, it's not a short book, but it's a pretty accessibly written book, and I mean, if the only 2 books you read in your life are that and Capital Volume 1, then I think you'll have the advantage of knowing the correct opinions. So that's definitely going to help you. But if you have extra time, you can read some of those other books too. No, I've never personally spoken to Luka or to Melania Trump. Those are the only 2 Slovenian names. But the 2 I have spoken to, both really good conversations.
I had fun though the weekend I did spend with some Slovenians. However, I did have to explain the evolutionary history of the buffalo, which was not easy because I didn't have a computer in front of me, and I had to do it all from memory.
And you mean of the animal, the buffalo?
Yes.
You get yourself into some real rubs, real situations where you're like, I gotta explain the evolution. That's a very Andy situation where like something really bad is going to happen if you don't explain it within 90 seconds from memory. I believe it.
The Slovenian mafia had one of his kids, and he had to talk about the situation by explaining the evolutionary history of the buffalo. They were really interested in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. So actually, speaking of debates, I do have one we're going to be able to tease a little bit in the post game. I think we're not quite ready to do that on the main show yet, but that's going to happen in person in LA sometime soon. Also, speaking of in-person events, I was too optimistic during the conversation. I believed at that point that I would have all the details to give on the show today. I do not. We're still ironing this all out, but I am going to be almost certainly doing a in-person event in Chicago on Labor Day, as it's like a panel thing. It's going to be co-sponsored by Jacobin in these times. So I will say more next week when, with any luck, we should actually have those details ironed out. But if you live in Chicago and you like the commie stuff, just, I don't know, keep your Labor Day open. Don't commit to spending it with your family or anything dumb like that. And yeah, maybe you can come check that out. Good chance of Bhaskar Sankara being there, and Mike Beggs, who we're co-writing that book with for Verso that I mentioned, and some people from In These Times. So yeah, when I have more details, I will certainly share them. The second I do, I'll put a little community post up here on the YouTube channel, so people will know. But right now, I just don't know. We're still figuring it out. Okay, so I think with that, since we are actually give me like 5 minutes, because I think patrons don't actually have the post. the post game link yet. So let me get 5 minutes, and we will go to the post game for GTAA patrons. So if you're a patron of the show and you need to, I don't know, smoke a cigarette or really briefly explain the evolutionary history of buffalo to somebody, you'll have time to do that. But we will see you in about 5 minutes in the post game. We have some fun stuff for that. So looking forward to that. I will see people then. Left is best.